The morning sun cast long shadows across the glass towers of downtown Chicago, painting the skyline in shades of gold and amber. Marcus Thompson stood on the sidewalk outside the Sterling and Associates headquarters, a 52-story monument to corporate ambition that dominated the financial district. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and allowed himself a moment to appreciate how far he had come. 34 years old, Harvard MBA, 12 years of experience climbing the corporate ladder at some of the most prestigious firms in the country. And now, after months of secret negotiations and careful planning, he was about to walk into this building not as the intern his badge proclaimed him to be, but as the new majority shareholder and incoming CEO of Sterling and Associates. The plan had been his idea, born from a conversation with his mentor, Eleanor Vance, the legendary businesswoman who had spent 40 years transforming struggling companies into industry leaders. "You want to know how a company really operates," she had told him over dinner 6 months ago. "Don't look at their quarterly reports or their mission statements. Walk their halls as someone invisible. Be the person they think doesn't matter. That's when you'll see their true colors." Eleanor had been more than a mentor to Marcus. She had been a lifeline during the most difficult years of his career. They had met at a charity gala in New York when Marcus was a junior associate, struggling to be taken seriously at a firm that seemed to have an invisible ceiling for people who looked like him. Eleanor had noticed him standing alone at the edge of the room, nursing a drink and observing the dynamics of power on display. "You look like someone who's trying to figure out the game," she had said, approaching him with a glass of champagne in her hand. "Is it that obvious?" Marcus had replied. "Only to someone who spent 20 years doing the same thing." She had smiled, and something in her eyes told Marcus that this woman understood things that most people never would. "Let me give you some advice, young man. The game they're playing, the one with the networking and the golf courses and the old boys club, you can learn to play it, but you'll never win it. Not really. Because it's not designed for people like us to win." Marcus had frowned. "Then what's the point?" "The point is to build your own game, to get so good, so successful, so undeniable that they have no choice but to let you in. And then, once you're in, you change the rules." She had handed him her business card. "Call me sometime. I think we have a lot to talk about." That conversation had changed the trajectory of Marcus's life. Eleanor had become his advisor, his advocate, and eventually his partner in the Sterling and Associates acquisition. She had taught him that success wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about using your position to open doors for others. Marcus had taken her advice to heart. When the opportunity arose to acquire a controlling stake in Sterling and Associates through a complex series of shell companies and private equity arrangements, he had insisted on one unusual condition. He would spend his first week at the company undercover, posing as a summer intern. No one would know his true identity except Eleanor, who served as the public face of the acquisition, and the company's board of directors, who had been sworn to secrecy. The goal was simple. Sterling and Associates had impressive numbers on paper, but rumors of a toxic corporate culture had circulated for years. Marcus wanted to see for himself, to understand what he was really buying, and to identify which leaders deserved to stay and which needed to go. He pushed through the revolving doors and entered the marble-floored lobby. The reception desk was staffed by a young woman with a professional smile who barely glanced at his intern badge before waving him toward the elevator bank. 32nd floor, she said. "The intern orientation is in conference room C." Marcus nodded and made his way to the elevators. As he waited, he observed the people around him, men and women in expensive suits, clutching coffee cups and smartphones, their faces set in expressions of determined ambition. This was the heart of corporate America, a world he knew intimately, a world he had conquered through talent and persistence, and an unwavering refusal to let anyone tell him he didn't belong. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and Marcus stepped inside. He was joined by a tall man in his late 50s, silver-haired and distinguished, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The man glanced at Marcus's intern badge, then at his face, and something flickered in his eyes. Not quite hostility, but something close to it, a dismissal, a categorization. Marcus had seen that look before. He had been seeing it his entire life, in classrooms where teachers assumed he was in the wrong honors section, in job interviews where interviewers seemed surprised by his credentials, in boardrooms where colleagues looked past him to address questions to someone else. The look was always the same, a quick assessment, a categorization, a dismissal, all happening in the space between heartbeats. His mother had warned him about this when he was young. "You're going to have to be twice as good to get half as far," she told him, her voice carrying the weight of her own experiences. "It's not fair, baby, but it's real. So you be excellent, you be undeniable, and you never let them see you bleed." He had taken her words to heart. Every slight, every insult, every closed door had become fuel for his ambition. Not anger exactly, but determination. A quiet, unshakable resolve to prove them all wrong. "Intern, huh?" the man said, his tone somewhere between condescending and curious. "First day?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, keeping his voice neutral and respectful. "Well, enjoy it while it lasts. Most interns don't make it past the first week here. Sterling and Associates isn't a place for the faint of heart." He paused, looking Marcus up and down with obvious skepticism. "Or for people who got here through alternative pathways." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but kept his expression pleasant. "I'll do my best, sir." The elevator stopped on the 32nd floor, and Marcus stepped out. Behind him, he heard the silver-haired man chuckle softly, a sound that carried more meaning than any words could have conveyed. The intern orientation was held in a sterile conference room with a view of the Chicago River. There were 8 other interns, all young, all eager, all dressed in their best approximation of corporate attire. Marcus took a seat near the back and listened as the HR representative, a harried-looking woman named Patricia, ran through the basics: company policies, dress code, expectations, and the all-important reminder that interns were expected to be seen and not heard. "You're here to learn," Patricia said, her eyes sweeping the room. "Not to share your opinions, not to challenge your supervisors, not to make waves. Understood?" The interns nodded dutifully. Marcus nodded along with them, playing his part. He observed his fellow interns with quiet interest. There was a young woman from Northwestern who seemed nervous but determined, a recent graduate from the University of Chicago who kept checking his phone, a pair of students from local community colleges who sat together, looking slightly out of place among their more privileged peers, and several others, each carrying their own hopes and anxieties into this corporate baptism. Marcus noticed something else too. Of the 9 interns in the room, he was the only black person. It wasn't surprising exactly. He had done his research on Sterling and Associates' diversity numbers, which were dismal even by the low standards of the financial industry. But seeing it in person, feeling the subtle isolation of being the only one, brought the statistics to life in a way that numbers on a page never could. Patricia droned on about workplace safety and email etiquette and the proper way to address senior executives. Marcus listened with half an ear, his attention focused on cataloguing everything he observed. The tone of the orientation, designed to humble and intimidate rather than welcome and inspire. The implicit hierarchy being established from the very first moment. The way certain interns were treated differently based on which schools they had attended, which neighborhoods they came from, which connections they could claim. This was how it started. This was how toxic cultures perpetuated themselves, not through dramatic moments of villainy, but through countless small signals that told people where they stood and what they could expect. After the orientation, the interns were assigned to various departments throughout the company. Marcus found himself placed in the Strategic Development Division, reporting to a senior vice president named Richard Harding. The name rang a bell. Richard Harding was one of the executives Marcus had flagged during his research, a man with impressive credentials but a troubling pattern of complaints from subordinates that had been quietly settled out of court. The strategic development floor occupied the 47th level of the building, a sprawling open-plan office with glass-walled conference rooms and a corner suite that presumably belonged to Harding himself. Marcus was shown to a small desk near the copy machine and given a stack of files to organize. "Just sort these by date," the assistant who had led him there said, barely making eye contact. "And try not to bother anyone. Mr. Harding doesn't like distractions." Marcus thanked her and set to work. As he sorted through the files, he observed the office around him. The atmosphere was tense, charged with an undercurrent of anxiety that he recognized from his years in corporate environments. People spoke in hushed voices. Eyes darted nervously toward Harding's corner office. When the phone on someone's desk rang, they jumped as if it were a gunshot. This was not a healthy workplace. This was a kingdom ruled by fear. Marcus thought about all the research he had done before this moment. The anonymous Glassdoor reviews that painted a picture of systemic dysfunction, the quiet settlements that had been buried in legal paperwork, the exodus of talented employees who had left for competitors, citing vague reasons that everyone in the industry understood to be code for the culture was unbearable. He thought about his father, who had worked for 30 years at a manufacturing plant where the foreman called him boy until the day he retired. His father had never complained, never fought back, never demanded the respect he deserved. "Keep your head down, do your job, and don't make waves," he had advised Marcus. "That's how you survive." But Marcus didn't want to survive. He wanted to change the game. He wanted to build a world where people like his father didn't have to choose between their dignity and their livelihood. Around 11 o'clock, the door to Harding's office swung open, and the man himself emerged. Richard Harding was exactly what Marcus had expected: tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of aggressive confidence that some mistook for leadership. He had a booming voice and a habit of standing too close to people when he spoke, using his physical presence as a tool of intimidation. Harding's eyes swept the office and landed on Marcus. For a long moment he simply stared, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, a cold, calculating smile that didn't reach his eyes. "New intern?" he asked, striding over to Marcus's desk. Marcus stood, extending his hand. "Yes, sir. Marcus Thompson, it's an honor to be here." Harding looked at the outstretched hand, but didn't take it. Instead, he picked up one of the files Marcus had been sorting and flipped through it dismissively. "Thompson," he repeated, as if tasting the name. "Well, Thompson, let me give you some advice. In this office, we value results. Not diversity hires, not affirmative action cases, results." He dropped the file back on the desk. "Do you think you can deliver results?" Marcus felt the familiar heat of anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "I believe I can, sir. We'll see." Harding turned and walked away, then paused and looked back over his shoulder. "Oh, and Thompson, try to blend in. You stick out enough as it is." The words hung in the air, poisonous and deliberate. Around the office, people studiously avoided looking at Marcus, their silence speaking louder than any protest could have. Marcus sat back down and continued sorting the files. His hands were steady, but inside, he was taking careful note of everything. Richard Harding had just revealed exactly who he was, and in less than a week, Marcus would have the power to do something about it. The rest of the morning passed slowly. Marcus completed his assigned tasks and was given more menial work to do: making copies, fetching coffee, sorting mail. He accepted each assignment with grace, using the opportunities to observe and listen. He learned that Harding had been with the company for 18 years, that he was widely feared but rarely respected, and that several talented employees had left the Strategic Development Division in the past year alone, citing personal reasons that everyone understood to be code for couldn't stand working for Richard Harding anymore. At noon, Marcus took his lunch in the employee cafeteria on the 20th floor. He chose a table in the corner and ate quietly, watching the dynamics of the room. The executives sat together at a table near the windows, laughing loudly and speaking with the casual confidence of people who had never been told no. The middle managers clustered in small groups, their conversations more subdued, and the support staff, the assistants and interns and mailroom workers, sat at the edges of the room, invisible and overlooked. It was a perfect microcosm of the corporate hierarchy, visible in the seating arrangements and body language, and the subtle patterns of who approached whom. Marcus had seen versions of this scene at every company he had ever worked for, but there was something particularly stark about it here. The divisions were sharper, the boundaries more rigid, the invisible walls more impenetrable. He thought about his own journey through corporate America, the times he had been the only black face in a room full of executives, the moments when his presence had caused visible discomfort, when people had stumbled over their words or made awkward jokes to cover their unease. The constant calculation of how to present himself, how much of his authentic self to reveal, how to navigate a world that hadn't been built for people like him. It was exhausting. Most people never understood how exhausting it was. The constant vigilance, the perpetual awareness of being watched and judged by different standards, the knowledge that every mistake would be magnified, every success questioned, every achievement attributed to something other than your own hard work and talent. But Marcus had learned to channel that exhaustion into fuel. Every slight became motivation. Every closed door became a challenge to find another way in. And now, sitting in this cafeteria, pretending to be an intern, he was about to do something that would change this company forever. A young woman approached Marcus's table, holding a tray with a salad and a bottle of water. She was perhaps 25, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked. "Everywhere else is kind of claimed." "Please," Marcus said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. The woman sat down and extended her hand. "I'm Jasmine Rodriguez. I work in HR. Marcus Thompson, intern in strategic development." Jasmine's expression shifted slightly at the mention of the department. "Strategic development. So you're working under Harding?" "I am. I'm sorry." The words came out before she could stop them, and she immediately looked embarrassed. "I mean, I shouldn't have said that. It's okay," Marcus said gently. "I get the impression he's not the easiest person to work for." Jasmine laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's one way to put it. He's been here forever and he's got friends on the board, so nothing ever changes. People complain, and the complaints just disappear." Marcus filed this information away. "Does HR handle those complaints?" "We're supposed to. But whenever something comes up about Harding, it gets escalated to the executive level, and then suddenly it's not our problem anymore." She shook her head. "I've been here 2 years, and I've seen at least a dozen good people leave because of him. It's not right." "No," Marcus agreed. "It's not." They talked for the rest of the lunch hour. Jasmine was smart and observant, exactly the kind of employee that a healthy company would nurture and promote. Instead, she was trapped in a system that protected people like Richard Harding while leaving everyone else to fend for themselves. She told him about her journey to Sterling and Associates, how she had worked her way through college, how she had believed this company would be different, how those beliefs had slowly eroded in the face of daily reality. "The thing that gets me," she said, stirring her tea absently, "is that it doesn't have to be this way. I've worked at other places. I know what good leadership looks like. But here, the people at the top seem to think that being cruel is the same as being strong. That fear is the same as respect." Marcus nodded slowly. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Jasmine was quiet for a moment. "Every day," she admitted. But I have student loans. I have a sick mother who needs help with medical bills. I can't afford to start over somewhere else, not right now. So I stay, and I do my job, and I try to make things a little bit better where I can." She laughed bitterly. "Some days that feels like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon." "It's not nothing," Marcus said. "The small kindnesses matter. Treating people with dignity when no one else does, that matters." Jasmine looked at him curiously. "You're different than most interns. Most of them are so eager to climb the ladder they'd step on anyone to get there. But you actually seem to care about people." Marcus smiled. "My mother raised me right." When lunch ended and Marcus returned to his desk, he found a note waiting for him. It was handwritten on Sterling and Associates letterhead, the penmanship aggressive and slanted. "Staff meeting, 3 p.m., main conference room. Attendance mandatory for all strategic development personnel. RH." Marcus glanced at the clock. 2 hours until the meeting. 2 hours until he would see Richard Harding in his element, performing for an audience. He couldn't wait. The main conference room on the 47th floor was a temple of corporate power. A massive mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than most cars. The walls were lined with awards and photographs, images of smiling executives shaking hands with politicians and celebrities, a visual testament to Sterling and Associates' influence and prestige. Marcus studied the photographs as he waited for the meeting to begin. He recognized several faces from his research. Former CEOs, board members, industry titans who had passed through these halls on their way to even greater heights of power and wealth. They were all white, every single one. In 50 years of company history, captured in dozens of photographs, there wasn't a single black face among the leadership. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice, repeated over and over again across decades, encoded into the DNA of the organization. The message was clear, even if it was never spoken aloud. Certain people belonged here, and certain people did not. Marcus had seen this pattern everywhere he had worked. The way opportunities were distributed along networks that excluded people who didn't fit a certain profile. The way mentorship went to those who reminded senior leaders of their younger selves. The way the same faces kept appearing in positions of power, while talented outsiders were passed over for reasons that were never quite articulated. It wasn't always malicious. Often it was simply the path of least resistance. People hired and promoted those who made them comfortable, who shared their backgrounds and assumptions and ways of seeing the world. They didn't think of it as discrimination. They thought of it as choosing the best fit. But the result was the same. A system that perpetuated itself, that locked out people who could have contributed tremendous value, that impoverished organizations by limiting the perspectives and experiences at the leadership table. Marcus was going to change that, not just at Sterling and Associates, but across the entire industry. That was the real goal, the larger vision that had driven him to attempt this audacious undercover operation. He wanted to prove that diversity wasn't just a nice idea or a box to check. It was a competitive advantage, and companies that embraced it would outperform those that didn't. Marcus arrived early and took a seat near the end of the table, in the section clearly designated for junior staff. As the room filled, he observed the hierarchy on display. The senior executives clustered near the head of the table where Harding would sit. The mid-level managers occupied the middle sections, and the assistants and interns were relegated to the periphery, present but not truly included. Harding entered last, as Marcus had expected. He strode into the room like a general surveying his troops, his eyes sweeping across the assembled staff with an expression of barely concealed contempt. He took his seat at the head of the table and didn't bother with pleasantries. "Let's get started," he said, his voice cutting through the murmured conversations. "I called this meeting because we have a problem. Our Q3 numbers are down 7% from projections, and someone needs to explain why." The room went silent. Marcus watched as the other staff members exchanged nervous glances, each one hoping the blame would land somewhere else. Harding's eyes moved slowly around the table, savoring the fear he inspired. Finally, his gaze settled on a middle-aged woman seated a few chairs down from Marcus. Her name tag read Sandra Chen, Senior Analyst. "Sandra," Harding said, his tone deceptively mild, "your team was responsible for the Henderson account. Care to explain why we lost it?" Sandra's face went pale. "Sir, the Henderson account, there were extenuating circumstances. The client had internal restructuring that affected their budget, and we were unable to meet their revised timeline because of resource constraints that I flagged 3 months ago in my quarterly report, which was submitted to your office for review." Harding's expression didn't change. "So you're saying it's my fault?" "No, sir. I'm saying that the circumstances were beyond our control, and that the warning signs were documented and communicated through proper channels." "Proper channels?" Harding laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the walls. "Let me tell you something about proper channels, Sandra. Proper channels are what people hide behind when they don't want to take responsibility for their failures. I don't care about your reports or your excuses. I care about results. And you failed to deliver." Sandra's hands were trembling, but she held her ground. "With respect, sir, the decision to not allocate additional resources to the Henderson account was made at the executive level. I have documentation that shows I requested additional support multiple times and was denied." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. No one challenged Richard Harding. Not publicly. Not like this. Harding leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Are you calling me a liar, Sandra?" "I'm stating facts, sir. Facts that are on record." For a moment, Marcus thought Harding might actually lose his composure, but instead, the executive leaned back in his chair and smiled that cold, calculating smile that Marcus had already come to recognize. "Facts on record," Harding repeated. "Well, here's another fact for the record, Sandra. You're fired. Clean out your desk by the end of the day." A gasp rippled through the room. Sandra sat frozen, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. "Sir, you can't fire someone for raising legitimate concerns," someone said. It took Marcus a moment to realize that the voice was his own. Every head in the room turned toward him. Harding's eyes found the source of the interruption, and his expression shifted from surprise to contempt. "I'm sorry," Harding said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did the intern just tell me what I can and cannot do?" Marcus stood, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "With respect, sir, Ms. Chen has raised documented concerns through proper channels. Terminating her for doing her job could expose the company to significant legal liability." The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved, no one breathed. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but his voice remained steady. He had spent his entire life preparing for moments like this, moments when silence would be the easy choice, and speaking up would carry consequences. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Never let them see you bleed." But there was another voice too, his own voice, the one that had driven him to build his career on the foundation of integrity rather than compliance. He thought about all the people who had been in this room before him, all the employees who had witnessed Harding's behavior and said nothing. Not because they were cowards, but because they couldn't afford the risk. They had mortgages and children and elderly parents depending on them. They had calculated the cost of speaking up and found it too high. But Marcus was different. Marcus had options they didn't have, and that meant he had a responsibility they didn't have. Harding rose from his chair slowly, like a predator scenting prey. He walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of Marcus, close enough that Marcus could smell his cologne and see the small vein pulsing in his temple. "Do you know who I am?" Harding asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes, sir. You're Richard Harding, Senior Vice President of Strategic Development. And do you know who you are?" "I'm an intern, sir." Harding smiled, and there was nothing warm about it. "That's right. You're an intern. You're nobody. You're here because some diversity initiative needed to check a box, and now you think you can walk into my conference room and tell me how to run my department. Marcus felt the eyes of everyone in the room on him. He knew what they expected him to do: apologize, back down, accept his place. That was how the game was played. That was how people like Richard Harding maintained their power. But Marcus had never been good at playing by other people's rules. "I'm here because I want to learn," Marcus said calmly. "And what I've learned today is that this company has a culture problem. You can fire me for saying that if you want. But firing people for telling the truth doesn't make the truth go away." Harding's face flushed red with anger. "You arrogant little—" He stopped himself, visibly struggling to maintain control. When he spoke again, his voice was tight with barely contained rage. "You're done here. Get out of my conference room. Get out of my building, and don't ever show your face at Sterling and Associates again." Marcus looked around the room at the faces of the other employees. Some were shocked, some were afraid. But a few, just a few, had something else in their eyes. Something that looked almost like hope. "Actually," Marcus said, reaching into his pocket, "I don't think I will." He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. The room watched in confused silence as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered, calm and professional. "Eleanor Vance speaking." "Ms. Vance, this is Marcus. I think we're ready to move up the timeline." "I see. Is the situation as bad as we suspected?" "Worse, actually. I'll give you the full report, but I think it's time for the announcement." "Understood. I'll have the legal team issue the press release immediately. Give me 30 minutes. "Thank you, Ms. Vance." Marcus ended the call and looked at Harding, who was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and growing unease. "What the hell was that?" Harding demanded. "Who is Eleanor Vance?" "Eleanor Vance is the managing partner of Vance Capital Partners," Marcus said. "The private equity firm that just acquired a controlling stake in Sterling and Associates. The acquisition was finalized last week, but we delayed the public announcement for strategic reasons." The color drained from Harding's face. Around the room, people were pulling out their phones, checking news feeds, whispering urgently to each other. "That's not possible," Harding said, but his voice had lost its edge. "The board would have told us." "They would have." "The board was under strict confidentiality agreements," Marcus said. "As part of the acquisition terms, I was granted full authority to evaluate the company's leadership and make personnel decisions as I see fit." Harding's eyes widened. "You? What authority could an intern possibly have?" Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out his real ID badge, the one that had been waiting in a secure location until this moment. He held it up so that everyone in the room could see. "My name is Marcus Thompson," he said. "I'm not an intern. I'm the new CEO and majority shareholder of Sterling and Associates. And Mr. Harding, effective immediately, you're terminated." The silence that followed was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. It was the silence of a world shifting on its axis, of assumptions crumbling, of power changing hands. Harding stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. This is some kind of joke. This has to be a joke. I assure you it's not." Marcus walked to the head of the table and took the seat that Harding had occupied moments before. "In the past 4 hours, I've witnessed discrimination, intimidation, wrongful termination, and a management style that could best be described as tyrannical. None of that is consistent with the values I intend to instill at this company." He turned to Sandra Chen, who was still sitting in shocked silence. "Ms. Chen, you're not fired. In fact, I'd like to discuss a promotion when you have time. It takes courage to stand up for yourself, and that's exactly the kind of leadership we need around here." Sandra nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me, thank yourself. You earned it." Marcus looked around the room at the assembled employees. "I know this is a lot to process. I know you have questions. Over the coming weeks, there will be many changes at Sterling and Associates, and I want to be transparent about what to expect. But the most important thing I can tell you right now is this. The culture of fear and intimidation that has defined this department ends today. From now on, this company will be a place where people are valued for their contributions, not judged by their appearance or background. A place where dissent is welcome and transparency is expected. A place where no one is above accountability. His eyes found Harding, who was standing at the edge of the room, his face ashen, his hands trembling. "Mr. Harding, security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Your severance package will be handled according to the terms of your contract. I suggest you leave quietly." Harding seemed to age 10 years in that moment. The arrogance, the confidence, the menacing presence that had defined him for so long simply collapsed, leaving behind a diminished figure who suddenly looked very small. "This isn't over," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "You can't do this. I have friends. I have lawyers." "I'm sure you do," Marcus replied, "and they're welcome to contact our legal department. But I think you'll find that when the full scope of your behavior comes to light, there won't be many people eager to defend you." 2 security guards appeared at the conference room door, summoned by an alert that someone had apparently sent during the confrontation. They approached Harding respectfully but firmly. "Sir, please come with us." Harding looked around the room one last time, searching for an ally, a sympathetic face, anyone who might come to his defense. But no one met his eyes. No one spoke on his behalf. 18 years of intimidation and abuse had bought him compliance, but it had never bought him loyalty. Without another word, Richard Harding walked out of the conference room and out of Sterling and Associates forever. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and for a moment the room remained frozen in stunned silence. Then gradually, people began to breathe again, to look at each other with expressions of disbelief and dawning hope, to whisper questions and speculations about what they had just witnessed. Marcus remained at the head of the table, giving everyone time to process. He understood what this moment meant for them. The world they had known, the rules they had learned to navigate, had just been overturned in the span of a few minutes. Some would welcome the change, others would fear it. All would need time to adjust. Sandra Chen was the first to approach him. She walked to the head of the table with tears still wet on her cheeks and extended her hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know how to say it any other way. Just thank you." Marcus shook her hand. "You don't need to thank me, Miss Chen. You stood up for yourself when you had every reason to believe it would cost you everything. That takes courage that most people never find. I was terrified," she admitted. "I thought my career was over. Instead, it's just beginning." Marcus gestured to the chair beside him. "Sit down. We have a lot to talk about." In the aftermath of the confrontation, the conference room erupted into a chaos of questions and exclamations. Marcus spent the next hour fielding inquiries, reassuring anxious employees, and beginning the process of introducing himself as the company's new leader. The official press release went live at 4 o'clock, confirming what everyone in the room had just witnessed. Within minutes, the story was picked up by every major financial news outlet. "Billionaire CEO goes undercover at own company, fires abusive executive," read one headline. "Corporate America's reckoning, new Sterling and Associates boss shakes up culture," proclaimed another. Marcus ignored the media frenzy as best he could. There would be time for interviews and public statements later. Right now, his priority was the people in this building, the employees who had spent years working under a regime of fear and now faced an uncertain but potentially better future. He stayed late that first night, walking the halls of Sterling and Associates long after most employees had gone home. The building looked different in the evening light, softer somehow, less imposing. He paused at the window of his new corner office on the executive floor and looked out at the Chicago skyline, at the lights of the city glittering like scattered diamonds against the darkness. This city had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He had grown up here, on the south side, in a neighborhood where dreams often died young and hope was a luxury few could afford. He had watched friends fall into cycles of poverty and violence that seemed impossible to escape. He had attended schools where textbooks were outdated and teachers were overworked, and the expectation of success was so low that merely surviving was considered an achievement. But he had also experienced the other side of Chicago, the gleaming towers of the Loop, the wealthy suburbs where opportunities seemed to fall from the sky, the elite universities where connections were made that would last a lifetime. He had moved between these worlds, never quite belonging to either, always aware of the vast gulf that separated them. That gulf was what he wanted to bridge, what he wanted. Not just for himself, but for all the kids still growing up on the South Side, still being told that their dreams were too big, still being measured against standards they had never been given the tools to meet. He wanted to prove that the accident of birth didn't have to determine the outcome of life, that talent and hard work could overcome even the most entrenched barriers. It was a naive dream, perhaps. The systems of inequality were vast and ancient, built into the very foundations of society. One man, even a successful man, couldn't dismantle them alone, but he could chip away at them. He could create opportunities where none had existed before. He could be living proof that the narratives of limitation were lies. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Hell of a first day, proud of you." He smiled and typed back, "Couldn't have done it without you." A knock at his office door made him turn. Jasmine Rodriguez stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of awe and nervousness. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. "I just wanted to say, I wanted to say thank you for what you did today, for what you said." Marcus gestured for her to come in. "You don't have to thank me, Jasmine. I meant what I said. This company needs to change, and it's going to take all of us to make that happen." Jasmine nodded, but she didn't move from the doorway. "Can I ask you something? And you can tell me it's none of my business if you want. Go ahead. Why did you do it this way? The undercover thing, I mean. You could have just walked in on day one as the CEO. Why pretend to be an intern?" It was a fair question, and one Marcus had been asking himself since the plan first took shape. He thought about it for a moment before answering. "Because I needed to see the truth," he said finally. "When you're the CEO, people show you what they think you want to see. They tell you what they think you want to hear. But when you're an intern, when you're someone they think doesn't matter, they show you who they really are." He walked to his desk and picked up the intern badge he'd worn that morning. It seemed like a lifetime ago now. "I grew up in a world where people made assumptions about me based on how I looked," he continued. "Where I had to work twice as hard to get half as far. Where doors were closed before I even had a chance to knock. I've spent my whole career fighting against that, proving that I belonged in rooms where people thought I didn't. And when I had the chance to buy this company, I knew I couldn't just look at the numbers and the reports. I had to see for myself what it was really like to work here. Because if the culture was as bad as the rumors suggested, then no amount of financial success would make this company worth saving." Jasmine was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "And now? Do you think it's worth saving?" Marcus looked around the office at the trappings of power that now belonged to him, but his thoughts were on the people he'd met that day. Sandra Chen, who had dared to challenge her boss even when she thought it might cost her everything. The employees who had looked at him with hope in their eyes when he stood up to Harding. And Jasmine herself, who had spent her lunch hour talking to an intern because she believed in treating everyone with dignity. "Yes," he said, "I think it is. It's going to take work. A lot of work. But there are good people here who deserve better than what they've been given, and I intend to make sure they get it." He thought about all the employees he had met that day, the ones who had smiled at him despite their own exhaustion, the ones who had treated him with kindness even when they had nothing to gain from it, the ones who had confided in him about their struggles because something in his demeanor told them he could be trusted. Those were the people he was fighting for, not the shareholders or the board members or the industry analysts who would judge his performance by quarterly earnings. The real stakeholders were the human beings who showed up every day, who gave their time and talent to this organization, who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Corporate America had forgotten that truth. It had become so obsessed with metrics and efficiency and shareholder value that it had lost sight of the fundamental fact that businesses were made of people. Not resources to be optimized or costs to be cut, but human beings with hopes and fears and families and dreams. Marcus was going to remind them. One decision at a time, one policy at a time, one example at a time. He was going to build a company that proved you could be successful and humane, profitable and ethical, competitive and compassionate. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever was. Jasmine smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Then I'm glad I'm staying. After she left, Marcus sat down at his desk and began to write. He had a lot of plans to make, a lot of changes to implement, a lot of trust to build. The road ahead would be long and difficult, full of challenges he couldn't yet anticipate. But for the first time since he'd walked into Sterling and Associates that morning, he felt genuinely optimistic about the future. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus threw himself into the work of transformation, meeting with every department, listening to concerns, implementing changes. He restructured the management hierarchy, eliminating layers of bureaucracy that had allowed people like Richard Harding to operate without accountability. He established new HR policies with real teeth, creating clear pathways for reporting misconduct and protecting whistleblowers. He instituted diversity and inclusion initiatives that went beyond checking boxes, focusing on creating genuine opportunities for advancement based on merit. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Some of Harding's allies, the executives who had benefited from the old culture of favoritism and fear, pushed back against the new direction. A few resigned in protest. Others tried to undermine Marcus's authority through whispered campaigns and subtle sabotage. Marcus dealt with each challenge calmly and decisively. He wasn't interested in revenge or petty politics. He was interested in building something better. 1 month after his dramatic first day, Marcus called a company-wide meeting. The auditorium on the ground floor of Sterling and Associates was packed with employees from every department, every level, every corner of the organization. They filed in with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, unsure what to expect from their unconventional new leader. Marcus stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. He recognized many of them now, had learned their names and their stories, understood their hopes and their fears. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "I know the past month has been a time of uncertainty and change. Some of you have embraced that change, others have resisted it, and I'm sure many of you are still trying to figure out what it all means." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When I came to Sterling and Associates, I came with a specific purpose. I wanted to see with my own eyes what this company really was. Not what it looked like on paper, not what the PR department wanted the world to believe, but what it was actually like to work here, day after day, for the people who make this organization run." He thought of his first morning, of the dismissive looks and the condescending comments, of Richard Harding's sneering face and poisonous words. What I found was troubling. I found a culture where fear was more common than respect, where power was used to silence rather than empower, where the people at the top had forgotten that their success depended on the people they led. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Marcus let it settle before continuing. "But I also found something else. I found people like Sandra Chen, who had the courage to speak truth to power, even when she thought it might cost her everything. I found people like Jasmine Rodriguez, who treated an intern with kindness and respect because that's who she is, regardless of what anyone else did. I found countless employees who came to work every day, did their jobs with integrity, and waited for the day when things might finally get better. He looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as he could. That day is today. That day is now. From this moment forward, Sterling and Associates is going to be different. We're going to be a company that values its people, not just its profits. A company where everyone has a voice and every voice matters. A company where the color of your skin, or where you went to school, or who you know matters less than what you contribute and how you treat others. He stepped out from behind the podium, moving closer to the audience. I'm not going to pretend this will be easy. Change is hard. It's uncomfortable. It requires us to examine our assumptions and challenge our habits. There will be setbacks and mistakes and moments when we wonder if we're on the right path. His voice grew stronger, filled with conviction. But I believe in this company. I believe in the people in this room, and I believe that together we can build something we're all proud of. Not because it's profitable, though I expect it will be. Not because it looks good in a press release, though it might, but because it's right. Because every person who walks through our doors deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Because that's the kind of company I want to lead, and I hope it's the kind of company you want to be part of. He paused, letting his words sink in. I've talked enough. Now I want to hear from you. In the coming weeks, I'll be holding open forums in every department. I want to know what's working and what isn't. I want to hear your ideas, your concerns, your hopes for the future. My door is always open, and I mean that literally and figuratively. He smiled, and this time it was genuine, warm, human. Thank you for giving me a chance. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being willing to believe that things can be better. They can, they will. I promise. The applause started slowly, tentatively, as if people weren't sure it was allowed, but it built quickly, swelling into a wave of sound that filled the auditorium. People were on their feet, clapping and cheering, some with tears in their eyes. Marcus stood at the center of it, humbled and energized and more determined than ever. This was just the beginning. The months that followed were transformative for Sterling and Associates. Under Marcus's leadership, the company underwent a comprehensive cultural overhaul. New policies were implemented, new leaders were promoted, new values were established. The changes weren't always smooth, but they were real. Employee satisfaction surveys, which had historically been dismal, showed dramatic improvement. Turnover rates dropped by 40%. For the first time in years, Sterling and Associates was appearing on lists of best places to work in the industry. The financial performance exceeded even Marcus's optimistic projections. It turned out that treating employees well wasn't just morally right, it was also good business. Engaged, respected workers were more productive, more creative, more committed. Clients noticed the difference too, and new business came pouring in. Industry analysts, who had initially been skeptical of the soft approach to management, were forced to reckon with the numbers. Sterling and Associates was outperforming its competitors on every metric that mattered. Employee retention was up, innovation was up, customer satisfaction was up, and profits, the ultimate measure in the corporate world, were higher than they had been in the company's entire history. Marcus gave interviews to business publications, not to boast, but to spread the message. "We've been sold a lie," he told Forbes in a feature article. "We've been told that you have to choose between treating people well and making money. That's nonsense. The companies that will win in the long run are the ones that understand that their people are their greatest asset, not just in a slogan on a wall, but in how they actually operate day to day." The article went viral. Marcus received thousands of messages from people around the world, from CEOs who wanted to transform their own companies to employees who wished their leaders would read his words. He couldn't respond to all of them, but he read as many as he could. But the change that mattered most to Marcus couldn't be measured in surveys or spreadsheets. It was visible in the faces of the people who worked at Sterling and Associates. The tension that had once defined the office atmosphere had lifted. People smiled more. They collaborated more. They took risks and shared ideas without fear of ridicule or retribution. 1 year after his dramatic first day, Marcus received a letter. It was handwritten on plain white paper with no return address. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Richard Harding. Marcus hesitated before opening it. He had heard updates about Harding over the past year. The former executive had struggled to find new employment, his reputation tarnished by the very public nature of his downfall. There had been rumors of legal troubles, of financial difficulties, of a marriage falling apart under the strain. Marcus had tried not to think about Harding too much. He hadn't set out to destroy the man. He had simply refused to tolerate his behavior. But he couldn't deny that some part of him felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and sadness at how things had turned out. He opened the letter and began to read. "Mr. Thompson, I've started this letter 12 times and thrown it away each time. I'm not good at this. I'm not good at admitting when I'm wrong. But I've had a lot of time to think over the past year, and I've come to realize some things that I should have understood a long time ago. When you stood up to me in that conference room, I was furious. I thought you were just another troublemaker, another person who didn't know their place. I couldn't see past my own assumptions, my own prejudices, my own desperate need to feel superior. But you were right about everything. I was a bully. I used my position to hurt people who couldn't fight back. I created a culture of fear because it was the only way I knew how to lead. And I told myself it was okay because I got results. I didn't get results. I got compliance. I got people who did the minimum necessary to avoid my wrath. I didn't get their best work, their best ideas, their best selves. I robbed them of that, and I robbed the company of that. I'm not writing this letter to ask for my job back. I know that's not going to happen, and honestly, I don't deserve it. I'm writing because I wanted you to know that I've heard what you've been doing at Sterling and Associates. I've read about the changes, the new culture, the awards and recognition, and as much as it pains me to admit it, I'm impressed. You built something I never could have built, not because you're smarter than me or more talented than me, but because you understand something I never did. You understand that people aren't tools to be used and discarded. They're human beings who deserve respect and dignity. I'm not sure I'll ever fully change. I'm 62 years old and old habits die hard, but I'm trying. I'm in therapy now, working through some things I should have dealt with a long time ago. I'm trying to repair the relationships I damaged, starting with my family. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that your example has made a difference, at least for one person. Sincerely, Richard Harding. Marcus read the letter twice, then set it down on his desk. He sat in silence for a long time, staring out the window at the Chicago skyline. He thought about the journey that had brought him here. The challenges he had faced, the obstacles he had overcome, the moments when giving up would have been easier than pushing forward. He thought about his mentor, Eleanor, who had believed in him before anyone else did, about his parents, who had sacrificed so much to give him opportunities they never had, about all the people who had helped him along the way, sometimes without even knowing it. And he thought about Richard Harding, a man who had spent his career wielding power like a weapon, who had made countless people's lives miserable, who had looked at Marcus and seen only a stereotype to be dismissed. A man who was now apparently trying to become someone better. Marcus picked up a pen and began to write. "Richard, thank you for your letter. It took courage to write, and I appreciate your honesty. I won't pretend that what you did didn't cause real harm. The people who suffered under your leadership carry those scars with them, and no amount of apology can fully undo that damage. But I also believe in second chances. I believe that people can change if they genuinely want to, and your letter suggests that you might be sincere in that effort. You asked for my forgiveness. Forgiveness is complicated. It's not something I can simply grant with a wave of my hand. But I can tell you this, I don't hold anger toward you. I don't wish you ill. I hope your therapy helps you work through whatever drove you to behave the way you did, and I hope you find peace. The best way to make amends isn't through letters or apologies, it's through actions. If you're serious about changing, then change. Treat the people in your life with respect. Use whatever influence you have left to make things better instead of worse. Be the person you wish you had been. That's the only forgiveness that really matters. Not what I think of you, but what you can become. Good luck, Richard. I mean that sincerely. Marcus Thompson. He sealed the letter and addressed it to Harding's last known address. Whether it would reach him or not, Marcus didn't know, but he felt better for having written it. Some stories don't have clean endings. Some villains don't get the comeuppance they deserve, and some heroes don't get the recognition they've earned. Life is messy and complicated and full of loose ends. But Marcus had learned something important over the course of his journey. Revenge wasn't the point. Punishment wasn't the goal. The point was building something better. The goal was creating a world where people like Richard Harding couldn't thrive, not by destroying them, but by making their way of operating obsolete. And that was exactly what he intended to keep doing. 5 years after that fateful first day, Sterling and Associates had become one of the most respected companies in the industry. The transformation was complete, recognized by business publications, studied in MBA programs, held up as an example of what was possible when leadership genuinely committed to change. Marcus stood at the window of his corner office, looking out at the same view he'd admired on his first evening as CEO. The city had changed in 5 years, new buildings rising, old ones falling, the endless cycle of growth and renewal that defined urban life. He had changed too. The driven young executive who had walked into Sterling and Associates in disguise had matured into a leader who understood that true success wasn't measured in quarterly reports or stock prices. It was measured in the lives you touched, the opportunities you created, the example you set. He thought about his younger self, the boy who had grown up in a modest house on the south side of Chicago, watching his parents work multiple jobs just to keep the lights on. He thought about the teachers who had believed in him when others wrote him off, the mentors who had opened doors that would otherwise have remained closed, the countless small acts of kindness and faith that had helped him become who he was. None of it had been guaranteed. At any point along the way, things could have gone differently. A teacher who saw a troublemaker instead of potential, a hiring manager who couldn't see past their assumptions, a door that stayed closed just a little too long. The path from where he started to where he stood now was narrow and treacherous, and so many people who were just as talented, just as hard-working, just as deserving, had fallen through the cracks. That was why representation mattered. That was why it wasn't enough to succeed as an individual. You had to reach back and pull others up behind you. You had to use your platform to create the opportunities that had been created for you. There was a knock at his door. It was Jasmine, now serving as his Chief Human Resources Officer, a promotion she had earned through years of dedicated work and genuine excellence. "The board is ready for you," she said. Marcus nodded and straightened his tie. Today was the annual shareholders meeting, a chance to reflect on the past year and look ahead to the future. "How do I look?" he asked. Jasmine smiled. "Like a CEO." He laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." It was meant as one. They walked together toward the boardroom, past offices full of people who no longer worked in fear, past conference rooms where ideas were shared freely and dissent was welcomed, past the very hallway where 5 years ago Marcus had first confronted Richard Harding and changed the course of the company's history. At the door to the boardroom, Marcus paused. "You know," he said to Jasmine, "I've been thinking about that first day a lot lately, about what might have happened if I hadn't stood up in that meeting, if I had just stayed quiet and played along. The world would be worse off," Jasmine said simply, "and so would this company." Marcus considered that for a moment. "Maybe. But I keep thinking about all the people who don't have the power I had. who stand up against injustice and lose their jobs, their reputations, their livelihoods. The outcome isn't always a Hollywood ending. No, Jasmine agreed. It's not. That's why it matters so much when people like you use their power for good, because you can afford to take the risk. And when you do, you make it a little bit safer for everyone else. Marcus nodded slowly. It was a responsibility he took seriously, not just to run a successful company, but to use his platform, his influence, his privilege to make the world a little bit fairer, a little bit kinder, a little bit more just. "Let's go," he said. "We've got a meeting to run." He pushed open the door to the boardroom and stepped inside, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because that's what leaders do. They show up, they stand up, they refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. And sometimes, against all odds, they change the world. Marcus thought about all the leaders who had inspired him over the years. The civil rights pioneers who had marched and bled and died for a future they wouldn't live to see. The business leaders who had proven that success and integrity weren't mutually exclusive. The everyday heroes, teachers and nurses and parents and mentors who had shaped young lives without ever seeking recognition. He carried all of them with him. Every decision he made, every stand he took was informed by their example. He wasn't just building a company, he was continuing a legacy that stretched back generations and would hopefully extend forward for generations more. The city lights glittered outside his window as Chicago settled into another evening. Somewhere out there, another young person was dreaming of a future that seemed impossible. Another employee was suffering under a boss who saw cruelty as strength. Another family was struggling to make ends meet while hoping for a break that might never come. Marcus couldn't save them all. No one could. But he could do his part. He could be an example. He could prove that another way was possible. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to inspire someone else to do the same. The story of Marcus Thompson and Sterling and Associates spread far beyond the walls of the company. It became a case study in business schools, a keynote topic at leadership conferences, an inspiration for people who dared to believe that corporate culture could be transformed. But for Marcus, the greatest reward wasn't the recognition or the accolades. It was the knowledge that somewhere, in boardrooms and offices and break rooms across the country, people were treating each other a little bit better because of the example he had set. That was his legacy. Not the profits or the awards or the magazine covers, but the simple, powerful idea that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. And he would spend the rest of his career proving it, one day at a time. 10 years after the acquisition, Marcus was invited to give the commencement speech at Harvard Business School. He stood before a sea of eager faces, young people on the verge of launching their careers, full of ambition and uncertainty in equal measure. He thought about what he wanted to tell them, what wisdom he could share that might make a difference in their lives. And he thought about the intern badge, the one he still kept in a drawer in his desk, the symbol of a choice that had changed everything. "You're about to enter a world that will test you in ways you can't yet imagine," he began. "A world that will ask you to compromise your values, to look the other way when you see injustice, to put profits before people and success before integrity." He paused, letting the words settle. "Don't do it. Don't let the culture of wherever you end up change who you are. Instead, be the person who changes the culture." He looked out at the faces before him, seeing in them echoes of his younger self. "I know that's easy to say and hard to do. I know that standing up comes with risks. I know that not everyone who speaks truth to power gets a happy ending. But I also know this. The people who stay silent, who go along to get along, who convince themselves that one person can't make a difference, they're the reason injustice persists." He stepped out from behind the podium, moving closer to the audience. Every great change in history started with someone who refused to accept the way things were. Someone who looked at injustice and said, "This is wrong, and I'm going to do something about it." That person wasn't always powerful. They weren't always rich. They weren't always connected. But they were brave. They were willing to take a stand, even when the outcome was uncertain. He thought about Sandra Chen, who had challenged her boss without knowing that salvation was coming. About Jasmine, who had befriended an intern simply because it was the right thing to do. About all the countless acts of courage, large and small, that had made the transformation of Sterling and Associates possible. "I'm asking you to be that person," he said. "Not because it's easy, not because it's safe, but because it's right. Because the world needs people who are willing to stand up even when everyone else is sitting down." He returned to the podium and looked out at the assembled graduates one final time. "You are the future, not just of business, but of society. The choices you make, the stands you take, the values you uphold, they will shape the world that comes after you. Make them count." He paused, then smiled. "And if anyone ever tells you that you don't belong in a room, that you don't deserve a seat at the table, that you're just there to check a box, remember this: you might be the person who transforms that room, that table, that entire organization. Never let anyone else define your worth. Define it yourself, through your actions, your integrity, and your refusal to accept anything less than what you deserve." The applause that followed was thunderous, washing over Marcus like a wave. He stood there, humbled and proud and grateful beyond words. Because this was his life's work, not just running a company, but inspiring others to believe that change was possible. That one person could make a difference, that the world could be better than it was, and as long as he had breath in his body, he would never stop proving it. 20 years after the acquisition, Marcus Thompson retired from Sterling and Associates. He left behind a company that was unrecognizable from the one he had found, a company that genuinely lived the values it professed, a company where people were proud to work. His successor was Jasmine Rodriguez, the woman who had shared lunch with him on his first day as an intern. She had spent 2 decades growing into the leader she was always capable of becoming, and Marcus had no doubt that she would continue the work they had started together. At his retirement party, surrounded by colleagues and friends and family, Marcus was asked to give a final speech. He stood before them, 70 years old now, but still sharp, still passionate, still committed to the ideals that had guided his entire career. "When I walked into this building 20 years ago, I was pretending to be someone I wasn't," he said. "An intern, a nobody, someone who didn't matter. And in a way, that pretense taught me the most important lesson of my life." He looked around the room at the faces he had come to love. "Every person matters. Every voice counts. Every act of courage, no matter how small, has the power to change the world. I've spent my career trying to build a company that reflects those values. And now I'm leaving that work in the hands of people who are far more capable than I ever was." He raised his glass. "To Sterling and Associates, to everyone who made this journey possible, and to the future, which I know is in excellent hands." The toast was drunk, the speeches were made, the tears were shed. And when it was all over, Marcus walked out of Sterling and Associates for the last time, leaving behind a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. He had proven what he set out to prove, that one person could make a difference, that culture could be changed, that dignity and respect weren't just nice ideas, but the foundation of true success. And he had done it not by being the most powerful person in the room, but by remembering what it felt like to be the least powerful, by never forgetting the intern who had been dismissed and underestimated and told he didn't belong. That was the secret. That was the lesson. That was the truth that Richard Harding had never understood and that Marcus had spent his entire career demonstrating. Power isn't about controlling others. It's about lifting them up, and that was exactly what Marcus Thompson had done. Throughout his career, he had faced moments where the easy choice and the right choice were not the same. Moments where staying silent would have been safer, where going along would have been smarter, where compromising his values would have been more profitable. Each time, he had chosen the harder path, not because he was naive about the costs, but because he understood that integrity wasn't something you could set aside and pick back up later. Once you started making exceptions, the exceptions became the rule. His mother had passed away 3 years after he took over Sterling and Associates. She had lived long enough to see him on the cover of business magazines, to hear him speak at conferences, to know that her son had become something remarkable. On her deathbed, she had taken his hand and said, "I always knew you would make me proud. But this baby, this is beyond anything I could have dreamed." He carried those words with him every day. They were a reminder of where he had come from and what he was fighting for, not just for himself, but for all the mothers and fathers who dreamed big dreams for their children, for all the young people who needed to see that someone who looked like them could reach the highest levels of success, for all the underdogs and overlooked and underestimated who needed proof that the world could be fairer than it had been. From his first day as a fake intern to his last day as a celebrated CEO, he had never stopped fighting for a world where everyone was seen, everyone was heard, and everyone had the chance to reach their full potential. It was a fight that would continue long after he was gone. A fight that would be carried forward by the countless people he had inspired and empowered and believed in, and that, more than any profit or award or recognition, was the true measure of his success. A life well lived, a difference truly made, a legacy that would never be forgotten. Marcus Thompson had come a long way from that first morning in the lobby of Sterling and Associates, and every step of the journey had been worth it, every single one.